Yes, I'm Stuart Levy of 1108 Foley in Champaign. And I would like to second Mark Enslin's thanks to several of you who came to the Unity March. So appreciate your attention to this issue. And I too would like to speak on the question of the township referendum. To some of you who I think are not sure whether this is really a good thing to support, may I point out that if we're caught in a confluence of several sets of rules, and one that has really put the township in this difficult position is misbehavior of the township officials back in the 1990s. Consider that they were then levying a tax and not spending it. They were bringing in more tax money than they had any need for, just because there was nothing preventing them from doing that. But I think it was a state Supreme Court ruling that said that that was an improper thing to do, which it was. But a consequence of that is that they then had a surplus to spend down, which again was reasonable in itself. But then this ran into the state tax cap law, which I think Champaign County voted itself into in the late 1990s. And the tax cap law, as you might remember, basically says that this year's expenses are like last year's expenses, and any exception has to be brought before the voters. That's often a reasonable assumption, but in this case, where the township administration's own misbehavior back in the 1990s had given them a surplus which had to be spent, that meant that the amount of money that they were bringing in, that they were levying for this purpose, was essentially zero, as it still is essentially zero. Not quite, but almost that. So now the surplus has been spent, and the township needs money to perform functions that are mandated by the state. But consider that if the township administration back in the 1990s had been acting properly, then we would have locked in a sustainable rate to fund the township for all its functions, including general assistance. This would be a complete non-issue. We would have locked in a tax rate that was infinitesimally higher than the current rate. I pay on my house, which is close to the median value, about $3,500 a year. I might pay $10 or $15 or $20 more than that if the township had been acting properly back then, but they didn't. Nobody would be giving a peep about this change if only that had happened back then, but it did not. So it really should be a complete non-issue. There should be no question as to whether this is a reasonable thing to support. Given that, as another speaker's diagram will show, Champaign is supporting its own poor vastly less well. It's taxing, at least, in order to support its poor, vastly less well than any of the other comparable central Illinois cities. Bloomington raises taxes to support its people in extreme poverty by a factor of about 20 more than Champaign does. And I think this is really a consequence of this impropriety back in the 1990s, which did not need to happen. So I hope, given this, you'll consider that it really is. You should have no question about supporting this issue. I'd like further to point out, some of you, I think, have been reluctant to speak publicly on this issue. I mean, some of you have spoken publicly, but I think some have been reluctant, thinking that you faced some sort of conflict of interest in supporting a tax referendum for for your township board. But the school board has had no trouble in publicly speaking in support of a bond issue, which again is, something that that's supporting something that they're in charge of. So I hope that you will feel free, and in fact that you will speak publicly, even tonight, and say that you support this referendum, if you will, because your support could make a real difference in how people of the city see it, and even whether they see it at all, given the obscure language that's required to be on the ballot in November. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and thanks for the plum. Stuart, I said thanks for the plum on the day of the walk. He helped me survive.